Welcome to She Defined, the podcast for smart, savvy women who are in search of more. I'm your host, Sharon Green. Today, I'm joined by Emma Lennon, She Define's feature writer. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you so much for having me.
Today, we're going to chat about friendship and the sometimes complex nature of friendships. For me personally, I highly value and prioritise friendships in my life. I love spending time with my girlfriends. They give me so much life and energy and contentment. But sometimes we can stumble upon tricky phases in our friendships that can be hard to navigate, like what to do when you're at different life phases to your friends, or what to do when you're dealing with a friend who never initiates. So we're going to chat about all of these issues today and share some of our advice and opinions. I want to start with an experience that I imagine a lot of women have gone through, especially as they've matured through their 20s and 30s and taken different paths as they've become older. And that's the experience of being at a different life stage to your friends. What happens when you find yourself at a different life stage to a close friend and suddenly your paths don't converge anymore? I think it can be quite a lonely experience when friends are reaching different milestones at different times, and you may even feel left behind. Or perhaps you're progressing in a new direction and finding you have less in common with some friends. I think the hardest part about this experience is that it may happen gradually and you're not necessarily noticing it. And it's happening over this long period of time, and then one day you suddenly realise, we've drifted apart. So it's not necessarily something that's dramatic that's happened to cause that shift. It's just that life has slowly been taking you in different directions. Emma, have you experienced something like this? Maybe you can share an example that others can possibly relate to.
Definitely. I think maybe one that's almost universal is sort of that period of life where maybe you're finishing high school or university and moving into your early career development phase. I know for me, pretty much as soon as I finished high school and I was midway through university, I moved away from my hometown. And as you said, very gradually, I just sort of was reaching out to my high school and my childhood friends where in the neighborhood I grew up in, less and less. We were both distracted with other things. And it's gotten to the point now, I don't think I have a single friend from high school or university that I'm still in contact with. And for a long time, I actually thought that meant something bad about me, that I wasn't, worth staying in contact with, or I was a bad friend because I let it fall apart. But friendships are definitely a two-way street. And I think part of the challenge there for me was realizing that some of those friendships were almost like situational or context dependent. And when there was no longer school or university or living down the road from each other to keep us close, we just both sort of stopped making much of an effort to try to sustain the connection, and it just naturally dwindled. And those kind of more ambiguous friendship breakups, if you want to call them, I think they can be almost more confusing and difficult to deal with than a dramatic conflict-derived friendship breakup, because there's no closure. You don't necessarily understand why it happened. But I also think that it's quite normal, and sometimes friendships aren't meant to last forever, and it doesn't mean that either of you were wrong or that the friendship wasn't meaningful. It just was there for a phase of your life, and now it's no longer.
Yeah, I've definitely had situations like that too, where as you say, there's sort of been situational friendships. You've maybe needed that person in your life during school or university or a particular other phase where it made sense to be intensely close with them, and maybe even help you guide through that period of your life. And so I kind of look back on those friendships quite differently now. I think after they dissolved, I felt sort of angry about it, or, as you say, unresolved, because it's not like we had a conflict that put an end to it, but then there was no closure either. But now I kind of look back and I go, actually, I really needed that person in my life at that time to teach me a particular lesson, or to just be a support at that point in time when I needed it. And so I don't necessarily look at it with anger anymore or resentment or anything like that. It's more that learning that, in life you might have friends that come and go for different seasons, but they're there for certain reasons as well. So that's kind of helped me navigate kind of going through those phases. I've also really definitely noticed the shift in my friendships sort of happen in my early to mid 30s, especially as a lot of my friends have chosen to have children and I haven't. So for many years we felt aligned, and now this massive life change sees us going in completely different directions. And understandably, my friends who've had children now have different demands in their life and different priorities. And in some cases, maintaining the friendship hasn't always been viable for them. And as they've filled their lives with children and mothers groups and play dates, I've noticed the gap in our social interactions. It's been very lonely at times for me, and I've had to really reframe the way that I approach my friendships in this phase of life. Have you experienced any of this kind of loneliness as well, where maybe some friends have gone in a different direction to you and then you kind of feel like you've been not left behind, but kind of like cut out of their lives a little bit? And why do you think we find this loneliness so challenging?
Absolutely. I have definitely felt lonely, or I just miss my friend when they are now focused on something that I'm so happy for them for. For me, it has happened the same way in terms of, I'm a child-free woman and many of my friends have gone on now to settle down to have kids. It's also happened for me in other ways because I do have other friends who are child-free, and our timelines are sort of misaligned in a different way, in the sense that they are now really, really hyper-focused on building careers and businesses. And I love what I do, but my journey was a little bit different. I think when I was a teenager and in my early 20s, I was already very serious about my career, and I was not going out, I was not partying, I wasn't traveling, I wasn't invested in making relationships. I think at that time in my life, I was in a little bit of a survival mode, and I was accumulating savings and really, really trying to get ahead in my career. And I did end up burning out. And now I feel that I'm almost having this like second adolescence where my hobbies and my friendships are equally as important to me as my job. And many of my friends are really, really knuckling down into their careers now. And I've noticed that some of them don't have as much time, or that their jobs take more of their time and energy away from them than mine does. And that can feel a little hard to relate to sometimes. And I might have free time where I'm craving that social interaction or connection and they're not available. And of course, I support them. I'm happy for them, whether it's children or their careers that are taking their energy. It's just that it understandably leaves a little bit of a gap in our social support network. I also think that it's very natural for humans to look to their friends to sort of gauge where they're at in life, and are we heading in the right direction? Are our lives progressing the way they, quote unquote, should be? I don't think it's a sign of weakness to want to fit in or be aligned with the people around us. It's kind of like a biological evolutionary need to feel like we are part of a community. I think that when we were in, many generations ago, we were actually in danger if we didn't have a strong community around us. So I think it's quite normal to struggle with feeling isolated or lonely in any way if we're not aligned with our friends.
Yeah, it's so true. I know that many psychologists who've done studies on this over the years have said that our friendship circle or our friendship group is kind of where we make sense of our own identity. It's how we find belonging in the world. And so maybe when an aspect of that is removed from our lives, we feel this gap or this hole that needs to be filled. And so I guess that's the loneliness that you might experience, or the challenges with losing a friend that you might experience, that feels so tough. I mean, I guess in some ways for me, just heading into sort of my mid to late 30s phase where I did really have that shift with friendships going in different directions, it really pushed me to go and find new friends that are aligned with my life phase that I'm in right now. And that's actually been like one of the best things. I think I kind of looked at my life and I was like, well, I can continue down this road of feeling isolated and lonely and only really seeing friends, especially the ones with kids, like when they've got time for me, which might be like once or twice a year, and just feel miserable with that, or I can try and do something about it. And so I've really put a lot of effort into like getting out there and meeting new people, and even encouraging friends of mine to introduce me to friends of theirs so that I can kind of form more of a network that way. I've gone to meetup groups and like really kind of put myself out there, because I'm like, if I don't put in the effort, then how can I expect to get anything back? And so that has been a really lovely way for me to meet new people and make new friends in my 30s, which I just didn't even think was going to be possible. And so I've got this entirely different friendship circle now compared to what I had even 5-6 years ago, which is really exciting. So I guess that's kind of the silver lining, is you can kind of make it work in your favor. I mean, I don't know if you've had that experience. I know you've made a lot of new friends through your dancing community, and I mean, a hobby is a great way to connect with people with like-minded interests. Have you had any instances where you've made new friends into your 30s?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there is a bit of a myth that by your, 20s or 30s or 40s, your friendship group is kind of set and is, no, we're not taking applications at this time. Thank you for your interest. And that's the case for some people. And that's great. But it isn't the case for me. I developed into quite a different direction than the people I grew up with. And being able to make friends through my hobby was incredible. And I think that I was quite lucky because many of the people I met in my hobby either sort of moved to Australia from a different country or from a different state. And so they also didn't have this set kind of clique already established that I had to try and then get myself into. They were also looking to build a new life and a new social support network for themselves. And it's a really beautiful opportunity to be like, this is where I'm at in my life now. This is what I'm looking for in a friend now. And I can be very intentional about who I invite into my circle rather than acting or staying with a friendship just because of history. I think there's a very good place for loyalty, and there are friends that I don't see often that I still absolutely adore, but our lifestyles just aren't aligned anymore. And as you said, rather than lamenting that, I wish them well and I love when I do get to see them. But when I need my social needs met, it's perfectly healthy, I think, to go and get those needs met where it makes sense.
Yeah. What do you think about this one? When friends go from being single into a serious relationship and then suddenly they have less time for their friends. So I've personally never understood why people do this, as I've always maintained my friendships regardless of, whether I've been in long-term relationships or not, because I value having them in my life and couldn't imagine my life without my friends in it. But I know it is quite common to hear about, the once single and social friend disappearing after they enter a serious relationship. I think that can be really hard if you're on the receiving end of that outcome. Have you had any experiences like this or heard any stories like that? And what do you think of it?
Well, I have to confess, I've been that friend and I was that friend. So for me, I didn't understand the impact that what I was doing when I got into my first real relationship, actually my only real relationship when I was 21 years old, I did disappear. I was the disappearing friend and I became extremely invested into my romantic relationship. And I think it's because, one, I was sort of societally conditioned to believe that my romantic relationship with a man was the most important thing that I could ever achieve in my life. It was a very kind of conditioned trope in media and film, and also what my loved ones, like my parents, were telling me that that's kind of my ultimate goal, to find someone to settle down with. And that was the most important thing, the most important relationship. I no longer believe that now, but I did. And it was also sort of the first relationship, romantic or otherwise, where I felt unconditional love and I was smitten. I put all of my eggs in this one basket. I looked to this person for all of my validation, all of my social needs, which is extremely unrealistic and unhealthy. And it didn't work out for the best. We had to really overcome that together. But I also think that for me, the reason I abandoned my friendships in that time was actually a bit of a self-esteem issue. I had pretty low self-worth in my 20s and I didn't really think about the impact I would have on my friends by disappearing because I didn't think that I mattered that much to them. So I thought that me disappearing, I didn't think that they would miss me. I didn't even think that they would notice. And of course, now looking back, that makes no sense. And I probably did hurt a lot of my friends by disappearing into my relationship. It just didn't even cross my mind. So I think if this has happened to you, that's awful. And the disappointment is so valid. I would maybe want to raise it with them because sometimes we don't understand what people's intentions are. And it's not to say that the behavior is excusable. But yeah, I think it's a really complex one and we don't always know why people might behave the way they do.
That's so true. Like your friends may not have known at the time that you didn't have great self-esteem. Would you have been open to or accepting of any of them coming to you and saying, hey, what's going on? Like, why are you neglecting the friendship? Like, would you have been okay for them to kind of call it out and try and resolve it? Or were you happy to just be like, leave me alone? I don't want to deal with the conflict right now.
I wonder, I mean, of course, now sitting here, I want to say I'm always open to criticism and feedback. But I think that it depends on maybe how it was said. I think if it came across as accusatory, maybe my defenses would have gone up and I would just not even want to hear the feedback. But if it had been phrased as, hey, I'm so happy for you in your relationship, but like I actually miss you and I would love to know that our friendship is still important to you, I think that would feel very different than you don't care about us anymore. But it's hard to say because I do think that I was more of an insecure person back then and that made me often quite defensive. But now, if anybody ever gave me that feedback, I think I would really appreciate it because I want to know that I'm making my friends feel valued and important no matter what else is going on in my life.
Yeah, for sure. I'm wondering, what advice can we share with others who are maybe going through this shift? How can we still maintain meaningful connections with our friends, even at moments when we're entering different life phases?
I think that if you've noticed that you and your friend are drifting apart, don't sort of write it off before you've had the opportunity to raise it with them. It's quite a vulnerable act to tell your friend that you miss them or you're concerned about the relationship. Again, I think that we're sort of told that friendships are somehow secondary to a romantic relationship like a marriage or a partnership, but I don't believe that's the case at all. And I think that that's also led to this idea that they're supposed to be very naturally occurring and you shouldn't need to put any real intention behind them. And that's just not been my experience whatsoever. So I think that it's hard sometimes to sit your friend down and say, I'm actually really not that happy with how our friendship's going and you're really important to me. Can we talk about our dynamic? And this is actually what I would really like from you. And what do you need from me? I don't know if those friendships are as normalized. Those conversations are as normalized in a friendship as they are in a romantic relationship. So I think giving your friend the benefit of the doubt and giving them the chance to make more of an effort. Again, like not every conversation like this is going to go well. And if the friend's not willing to make an effort or is dismissive of your feelings, that might be a signal maybe that that's, of a broader issue. And there are just bad friends out there that aren't right for you. But if that person is important to you, I would give them the chance to talk it out and see what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. One thing that I've done, because maybe sometimes there hasn't been the opportunity to talk it out or to confront or, bring it up with them in a way that feels compassionate or understanding, is I've just given the friendship a bit of space. And then we've come back after a bit of time and kind of rekindled. And that's not to say that I didn't want to be there for the friend at the time, but I just recognized we were both in this moment where maybe things weren't gelling because life was pulling us in different directions. And so I just sort of decided, give it a bit of a breather, come back in a few months and see if we can pick things up from there. And in some cases, this has worked really well because we've kind of just given each other the space we've needed to get through our stuff, whatever it is we were going through personally. And then we've met each other back where we kind of like pick things back where we left off, a few months down the track. And one thing I'm really noticing now, especially with my friends who've gone ahead and had children, is that initially when they have kids, they're going through this extremely intense time with newborns and whatnot, which is so understandable, like life becomes all consuming. But then, a couple of years later, once the children are starting to grow up and get a bit more independence and then they're getting a bit more flexibility with their time, they're sort of coming back around and I'm seeing a lot more of them now. So I feel like speaking to that point on if you have chosen not to have children and you feel like you are going through a shift with your friendships with the friends that are having kids and you're not really aligned anymore, is that sometimes it's just time that will kind of bring you back together if you are interested in keeping that friendship going long term. It's obviously a different question if you feel like there's a fundamental issue with the friendship and it's no longer worth pursuing. But, you know, if there is history there and genuine connection and you get along well with them, but you just hit this hurdle in life where your lives are not quite aligning anymore, maybe just give it some space and you can come back to each other down the track and pick up where you left off.
Yeah, that's great advice, because even if you're feeling very emotional or hurt by something, you might not handle the situation in the way you would really like to anyway. So just giving yourself some time to maybe even focus on other areas of your social support network that are nurturing you. And I think friendships that are very resilient and long-standing need to be flexible and adaptable. So I think that's great advice.
Yeah. And another thing, just speaking about difficulties with friendships in general, is, and I can only say this now that I'm older and I've gone through, you know, a good couple of decades of going through different friendships and also sustaining long-term friendships as well, is that just being aware that friendships can evolve and shift and change and even completely dissolve, like just knowing that that's a thing that can happen and being aware of that, I think is really helpful, because then it kind of manages your own expectations around how relationships in your life can ebb and flow. Having this expectation that, you know, we're going to be BFFs, you know, forever until we die. I think that's such a horrible expectation to place on yourself and even to maintain, because you just don't know what's going to happen in life and where things are going to go. So being more open and flexible towards your friendships and understanding that, you know, maybe you might go through periods that are great and then maybe not so great, but then it might be great again. Like just being open to that, I think has really helped me feel a little bit more ease with my friends and just kind of looking at life in general in terms of my relationships and how they interact. So I'd say, you know, if you have been ditched or are no longer friends with a good friend and you're feeling sadness over that, like give yourself the chance to grieve that friendship or the dynamic of what that friendship once was. So potentially you might still be friends with someone who you've been friends with a long time ago, but the dynamic has changed and you miss what you had, like it's no longer the same. And it feels like something's missing every time you meet up, but you still meet up because there's the connection there or something special there, but it's just different. I think it's important to just let yourself feel sad for that and try and move forward in the best way that you can, and just be open to new ways of keeping that connection alive. Perhaps the friendship needs to evolve into something new and something different, and it's not going to be the same as it once was. I mean, I have plenty of friends that I may only see once or twice a year because our lives don't really intersect that much anymore, but I still enjoy our time together. And, you know, I've kind of started to look at it as, you know, I enjoy the time that we do have rather than feeling bitter about all the time we're not getting together. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly.
So maybe that's me growing up a little bit, but I've really shifted my expectations of what I think I should be getting from the relationship. Do you have any thoughts around, you know, managing expectations in friendships?
Yeah, I think you've made really great points. I'd probably just echo most of them. I think so many things in life are really hard work anyway. I don't know if we need to make friendships this really high bar we set for ourselves and just another way that we're putting pressure on ourselves to perform. It's 100%, as you said, our lives ebb and flow and our relationships ebb and flow. And if you are very rigid in what you expect from your friendships and of yourself in those friendships or of the other person, I think it can be a bit of a breeding ground for conflict and feeling maybe resentful or let down. And it just doesn't need to be the case. I think shoulds are often unhelpful or unrealistic in things that are as complex and dynamic as human relationships.
Yeah, for sure. I want to talk now about reply-only friends. You wrote a great article about this a couple of years ago and it still gets so much attention online. So this is basically the notion that you only have a friendship with someone when you initiate something with them. So they will only ever reply to you when you reach out, but you've always got to be the initiator. So that's sort of the context in which we're talking about this now. I think it can be a really tricky one to navigate because there's no sinister feelings that are going on. There's nothing like bad that's happened. And usually when you reach out to the friend, their response can be quite positive. And so then you can't really feel annoyed about the fact that you've been the one to reach out because they've responded so well and often always say yes to a catch up when you suggest it. So it's kind of this really like grey area in friendship, I think. And it can make it feel really one-sided, especially if you're the person that's always doing the reaching out. So what I wanted to look at was what are your thoughts on finding yourself in a friendship where interactions only occur when you initiate them? Have you had any experience with that?
I think so. And I say I think so because my opinion is that we are all incredibly biased when it comes to our relationships because there's such emotional experiences. And as much as I have had friendships where we've actually had this exact argument. We were basically arguing over who loves each other more or who puts more effort into the friendship. And it sadly got quite nasty. But I think what was happening is that we were both so biased in how we were viewing the relationship. Like we both were making an effort in our own unique way and the other person didn't seem to recognize it. And we both felt like we were always initiating and making more of an effort. And I guess just that's not possible that we were both correct. So we must have both been seeing things with a bit of a biased lens. And I don't say this to say, you know, some people really genuinely are making all the effort. Don't sort of dismiss your feelings or your experience, but to maybe just acknowledge that maybe we aren't seeing the dynamic perfectly clearly because we're emotionally invested. But at the same time, I think it's very natural to want reciprocity in our relationships. And if we feel that we're the only ones to ever suggest hanging out, for me, I would start to think, does this person want to spend time with me or are they just very polite? And I would start to second guess myself, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And in that article that you wrote, you spoke with Dr. Marissa G. Franco. She's a psychologist and friendship expert. And she said that when we are often oblivious when a friend has consistently been the first to reach out, but we easily recognize when we are, which I think is to your point about recognizing your own bias and thinking, hey, I'm always the one to reach out. So, yeah, it's definitely suggesting that there may be in some way a level of bias in the way that we view our interactions with our friends. Do you think it's good to be more aware of this as we are navigating any challenges around friendship?
Definitely, because I think if we just assume that what we're feeling is a fact, so if we're feeling that there's less reciprocation of our efforts from a friend than we would like, and we believe that because we feel it, it's 100% true, we might sort of become quite reactive rather than being able to approach the conflict with more mindfulness and awareness. So I think that if you're feeling this way, it doesn't mean that it's invalid, but I would be cautious to maybe just sit with that emotion for a moment and decide what's actually a productive way to raise it with your friend. Because I think if that friend is completely unaware that this dynamic is happening for you and all of a sudden you're coming across as critical and why don't you ever try to make an effort to see me, that's going to feel pretty jarring and it might create a conflict that absolutely isn't even present. Whereas if you had raised it with a more gentle question of, I really value our friendship, I'd love to know you value it too. It'd mean a lot to me if you'd suggest a way to hang out. That's probably going to be met very differently. So I think that being aware of a potential bias just helps create a little bit more emotional space for us to respond rather than react.
Yeah. I do wonder as well if technology is playing a huge role in this dynamic, this sort of reply-only kind of dynamic, because, you know, we can live our lives on social media and feel like we're connected day to day, but we're not actually interacting with each other. Like, it's quite funny. Sometimes I see some of my friends like a post of mine, but they won't be in touch with me to be like, oh, hey, how was that event that you went to? Or just checking in to see how your week's going. But I know that they're kind of tuning in through my social media, but we're not in touch. And so it's this weird dynamic of like being connected, but then also not. And so, yeah, what are your thoughts on how technology is playing a role in this sort of shift in how we communicate with our friends?
Oh, I think it's completely transformed how we approach friendships. Firstly, exactly as you said, we can have this sort of false illusion of being quite close to a lot of people because we think that we're seeing the day-to-day events that are happening in their lives, and we feel that we're showing support by clicking a button but not actually speaking to one another. And we have, you know, close friends Instagram stories, and we think we know exactly what's happening with a person's day-to-day life, but as we all know, social media is a highlight reel, and I'm someone who I try to be quite authentic in my presence online. But if I'm having a day where I'm extremely lonely or depressed or angry, I'm not posting a selfie saying, hey, reach out to me, I'm struggling. Like, I don't do that. Some people do, but I personally don't. So I think that we do have this false illusion that we're closer to people than we think we are, or than we really are. And then another part of it, I think, specific to reply-only friendships, is that we now have technology to give us time-stamped receipts of all of our interactions. So maybe a generation ago, we wouldn't have had the ability to overthink who was initiating contact as much as we can now, unless people were really, checking who sent the last letter or who visited last. It might have just been something that didn't really cross their minds as much. It was just, you spent time together when you could and it didn't really matter as much. And now, if I was feeling a little bit neglected by a friend, I can grab my phone, I can open our messages and say, see, look, I texted first the last 12 times. And conveniently, I can ignore the context that I know she's extremely busy with work or that she just had a baby. I'm going to ignore that because I'm looking for information that confirms what I'm feeling. And I might not scroll back far enough to realize that last year when I was busy, she reached out more often first. So I think that technology is giving us all these receipts and these ideas that we know exactly what's going on, when that's not always the case.
Yeah, you make such a good point. It's like we've got documented evidence now to go, I've been in touch this many times and you haven't. And it's so easy to kind of like back up your feelings of, wanting to be defensive about it. And whereas maybe pre-phones and pre-social media, we didn't have that. So we would just kind of brush it off or, I don't know, try again another day. Just be a little bit more flexible with it. I wanted to impart some advice just on navigating this sort of shift in dynamics of friendships. And I would say that if you are noticing that dynamic in a friendship shifting and maybe you don't like it, it could be a really good opportunity to just assess the friendship overall and just think about how you feel about it and what you want from it going forward. So almost think of it like doing a little bit of a friendship audit just on your own, just going like, is this someone that I still want to maintain a friendship with? Why are they important to me? What's in it for me if I do continue to put effort into this? Is it even worthwhile to keep putting effort into this? Do I gain something beneficial every time I see this friend? Asking yourself sort of healthy questions like that to really think about how you see the friendship and whether you want to continue it going forward. Because maybe you might be in a situation where you've been drifting apart for a few years, but you haven't wanted to admit it to yourself, but now you can see it for what it is. Or maybe there are some changes you want to make. Maybe the way in which you interact with this friend might be different going forward. Maybe you see less of each other, but the time that you do spend together is good quality time and you still enjoy it and get a lot out of it. It doesn't have to be a frequency thing. I think that's always like a really good opportunity to just go, hang on, this is a moment where I can just assess the friendship, see what I think of it and what I want from it going forward, rather than looking at it as all doom and gloom because suddenly you're navigating this kind of uncharted territory. Again, going back to that expectations of friendships, I think I mentioned this before, and just maybe adjusting those expectations a little bit, and think about things like if it's important to you to keep in touch, are you okay with only seeing each other like a few times a year or whatever that looks like to you? And if that friendship is important for you to maintain, is it then okay if you are always the one to reach out? Like, does it actually matter? This is something I've really challenged myself on in the last couple of years because I think I'm often the initiator and then I feel resentful when I'm like, well, I'm always organising and doing the things and reaching out to friends and why doesn't anyone ever think of me? But then I always enjoy it when I catch up with my friends. And the reason we're coming together is because I've reached out. So I'm getting what I want out of it. So what's the problem? I've really had to think about, am I okay with being an initiator if it means that I still get to see my friends? And in most cases, I'm like, yes, I can live with that. So yeah, just challenge your own views, I guess, instead of kind of just getting angry about it. And yeah. Do you have any other advice if people might be going through tough times in their friendships?
Yeah, I just want to also say, I think that that's such a beautiful role that you clearly play in your friendships. And they probably really, really value and appreciate that, because some people might really struggle to organize events or might have their own reasons for being really hesitant to reach out. So I really understand why it might feel a bit like deflating sometimes and you wish they would make that effort in return. But I bet if they knew that you felt that way, they'd be like, we're so appreciative. We love spending time with you. Thank you so much for always organizing. So it's just very interesting how we can experience the same thing in really different ways. But my advice, I guess, would be, unsurprisingly, I'm quite an introspective person. So whenever I'm having a strong emotional reaction to something that someone else is doing or not doing, I once got the advice, if you're having a strong reaction to something, try to get as curious about your own internal response as you are about the other person's motivation. So, for example, if I was feeling a bit upset that a friend of mine wasn't reaching out very often, I would try to put off responding to them before I can try to sit with my own internal experience first. What I mean is, if I'm feeling really upset that my friend hasn't reached out and I really dug deep into what I was really feeling, I think I would find loneliness, insecurity, disconnection. And if I was able to sit with that for a bit longer, I'd probably realize that it's actually stemming from something much more long-standing than this one friendship. It's probably something that dates back all the way to my childhood or very early experiences. And that's not actually this friend's fault. This is actually something quite deeply entrenched within me, which is why it's so triggering. Whereas some people might never even consider it, might never even second guess whether they were always the one to reach out first or not, because that particular relationship wound isn't there. Because I think we talk about relationship trauma in the context of romantic relationships quite often. But for me, I think that I had a lot of friendship trauma when I was younger, of friends who mistreated me or were unkind to me. And I carried that forward for a lot of years. So I think sometimes we might be having a very strong reaction to something our friend is doing or a way that they're not showing up for us. And it might not be anything to do with that friend. And as much as you can still have every right to adjust your friendship so that they meet your needs, there is often also some internal work to do with our attachment styles to friendships, not just romantic partners. And I try to think of it as it's not my fault that I have particular relationship traumas, but it is my responsibility now to work through it and be able to show up in my relationships in a way that meets my needs without putting all that power and that onus on the other person. So my response is always to go inward. It's always my way.
Yeah. And I think that's such a great point to end on. So I think we'll wrap it up there. Thanks so much for imparting all of your advice and your wisdom around friendships. It's been great to chat today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining our discussion. If you enjoyed it, be sure to hit that subscribe button or leave a comment or review. I've been your host, Sharon Green, and if you'd like to learn more about She Defined, you can visit our website at shedefined.com.au.